Thank you, Sergio. Thank you, and thank you all for coming on a rainy night and agreeing to speak English for an hour and a half or so. We're starting a little bit late, so we'll probably run a little bit late as well. As Sergio said, over the next couple of days, we'll be having a Future Trends Forum. And the subject of that will be the question, how will longevity change the world? So you probably know something about the data about lifespan, but just to put that in some sharp relief, in 1900, the average lifespan in the developed world was less than 50 years old. So life expectancy at birth was under 50. By 1930, it had risen above 60. And today, it's in the mid-80s, depending on where you live. So it's really quite a startling change in the human condition. How long you can expect to live, at what age people have children, how many children they have, how long they're alive while their children are alive. All of those things have changed in the last 100 years. And they're changing again. I need a clicker. Thank you. Let's try this one. Oh, there it is. Sorry. So the Future Trends Forum is not going to be about aging itself or even demographics. It's going to be about the implications on how we live. So a couple of statistics from a recent Economist report on aging. That if you look at the share of the population that's over 65 from 1950 through the next 100 years, it goes from 5% in the world to 16%. For the OECD countries, from 16 to 25%. So the population that you see on the street as you walk around is going to look a little different. The global so-called dependency ratios, and this is defined as the number of people in the population over 65 divided by the number of people 15 to 65. So that's going from one person, one, quote, old person for 7.7 others, to one over 3.8. Now, I think John will talk about this, that this idea of dependency ratio embodies lots of assumptions about how the world works, that old people are supported by young people, old people are defined as people over 65, and that they're not productive but dependent. All of those questions are up for discussion. And am I doing this in the wrong direction? Yeah? Yeah. Oh, that one, I got it. Sorry. And yet. Sergio, help me out here. I think that's Dora's presentation. Okay, we're getting warmer. Here we go. There we are. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Okay, so quickly I want to tell you a little about the scope of this question and what we'll do over 2 days, and then you'll see where tonight's event fits. So the way the forum begins is we do some research trying to understand the nature of, I'm going to bet this is, no. Do I have a laser here? No, okay. If you look at the gray words in the first ring around the implications of aging population, we talked to about a dozen experts in the beginning of this process, and they told us that the education was going to change, the sense of ethics was going to change, businesses and labor are going to change. Walk your way around that circle, and more or less every aspect of life and society is going to change. And so the forum is designed to try and listen to experts in each of those and figure out what is likely to be different. Sergio, this speaks Spanish, apparently. Oh, there we go. All right. And we'll have 3 goals: to illuminate the range of changes in store as population age in the developed world, to develop scenarios reflecting how these changes will come together as they interact, and project how society will evolve as a result, and finally, to identify actions and opportunities for business leaders, policymakers, investors, and individuals to take action now based on the expected shifts. So that both tells you about this meeting, but it also tells you about how the Future Trends Forum works. It gathers experts of different types, brings them together, asks them some reasonably focused questions, and tries to come up with some original answers. So that's what we'll be doing. Tonight, we're going to focus on a couple of the questions that we've developed, those 2 that are in orange. One is about the idea that work spans, as opposed to lifespans, the amount of time people, the length of time people spend being productive in the economy, will become longer, while the half-life of knowledge is growing shorter, and what are the implications for work and skills? And John Martin is an expert in this subject, and so we brought him here to talk about that. A second question: what support will older people need to ensure a healthy future? And Dor has a venture developing robots that can assist people. We'll talk more about that. But so those are the 2 questions we chose to address in this session tonight. And I think we want to make one more point, which is we'd like to be interactive tonight. We'd like to make this a conversation. And in order to do that, we want to start by asking you a question. So would you take out your smartphones, please, and go to this URL, where we'll ask you a question or 2. No. Okay. Is that you okay? Do you still need the URL? No. All right. So the question we have for you is, at what age do you expect to stop working? Doris says there's no 40. So, right. Fair enough. You make a good point. Are we? Go back to the URL? Yeah. Dora, you've you should see the question on your screen, right? So you pick A, B, C, or D and text it. Here we go. So Dora, you've done 5 ventures already. It seems unlikely to me you're going to stop working by 40. All right. So interesting distribution. John, is this surprising you at all?
Yes.
Yeah.
A few minutes.
Yeah, good, excellent. All right, did everybody have a chance to vote? So On the modal answer is 61 to 65, but a lot of distribute, but 28% of you greater than 70. Now we'll ask you one question that tries to see why you feel the way you do. Let's go to the second question, which asks how you feel about oh, it changed a little at the end there. Will they see it on their phones? Yeah. Here we go. Which statement best reflects your thought about retirement? And of course, you may have other thoughts, and we'll bring those up later when in the discussion. But here are 4 possibilities. I'm looking forward to being able to do what I want. I have no idea what I'll do with my time. I'm afraid I won't have enough money. I don't think I'll ever stop working in some way. So this is pretty cool. Everybody knows what they want to do, and they're going to be able to afford to do it. This is a very special group. Yeah. Everybody have enough time? Well, thank you for this data, and we'll probably use it in the next 2 days in the full forum. It's an interesting sample. So, all right, I would like now to introduce a true expert, John Martin, who, as you see in your program, is a member of the Irish government's Labour Market Council, a member of the National Statistics Board of Ireland, and crucially for this purpose, founding editor of the OECD Employment Outlook. And he spent many years looking at policies with respect to employment and aging. We've asked him to come and talk to us for 15 minutes or so. John.
Chris, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. The title of my presentation this evening actually gives an answer to Chris's question about how longevity will reshape the world. The title of my presentation is Live Longer, Work Longer. So there you are, in a nutshell. What I want to do, ladies and gentlemen, here in the time allotted to me, is to give you some information about how the labor market for older workers has evolved over the past 2 decades in OECD countries. What are the main forces at work? And what are the main obstacles to working longer? I'll also end by speculating a little bit about the future for older workers in the context of the 4th Industrial Revolution and the gig economy. And I'll also try to highlight the specific situation of Spain wherever possible. So, could I have the first slide, please? Great. So, with regard to the employment rate of older workers, which I take to be the age group 55 and over relative to the population of that age, there's good news. The past 2 decades have actually witnessed a sharp break in trend compared with the previous 4 decades. The previous 4 decades after the 1950s were marked by a clear trend towards a falling retirement age in many OECD countries. So don't forget that. And many books were written actually about, as it were, how we could look forward to longer and longer retirement ages in that period. But the trend to early retirement has been reversed in almost all OECD countries since the late 1990s. You will see from the chart up there that the employment rate on average for older workers in the OECD age 55 to 64 rose by 12 percentage points roughly. It increased by a large amount both in the EU average and also in Spain. This is good news in the context of rapid population aging. People are now working longer. What's also interesting, and relates to the first question that Chris asked you, look at the age group 65 to 69 and 70 to 74. And what do we see here, ladies and gentlemen? Well, we see that there's been a significant increase in those age groups too in the OECD. You go from a period that now roughly 1 in 4 of people aged 65 to 69 are working in the OECD area, and 1 in 7 of those aged 70 to 74. The disturbing news for this audience, by the way, all of you who thought that you should be working till you're 70 and over, look at Spain. Spain lags very much behind the rest of the OECD and even the European Union average in terms of the proportion of people aged over 65 who are still working. Now, you may all be exceptions to this rule. We shall see. Now, what are the main forces behind this trend towards working longer? I want to highlight 3. First, there's been a generalized drive by public policies to encourage people to stay longer in the workforce. And this has taken several different forms. First, there's been a large-scale rollback of early retirement policies, which were very popular in most OECD countries in the 1970s, 80s, and early 1990s. Many countries, including Spain, have also raised the statutory retirement age in public pension systems and have taken steps to equalize the statutory retirement age between men and women, because typically in the past, the statutory retirement age was lower for women than for men. In addition, there's been a growing trend across OECD countries to link the statutory retirement age to life expectancy as a means of ensuring the financial sustainability of public pension systems in the future. Secondly, there's a long-term effect favoring working longer via the rising educational attainment of older age cohorts. Because it's well known that those with higher education tend to work longer and have better career prospects than those with lower education. Now, my judgment is that these forces driving working longer are not likely to be reversed in the future. For one thing, there's a fairly generalized upward trend in the statutory retirement age from 65 to 67, 68 in many OECD countries, and the day is surely not far off when 70 becomes the new, and I would argue temporary norm for statutory retirement age. For another, average educational attainment rates continue to rise in most countries, mainly due to rising participation in tertiary education. So all that's good news, I think. But at the same time, it's important not to cry victory too soon. For one thing, the rising trend that you see in this table in older worker employment rates has still not brought us back to where we were in 1980. Now, one way to illustrate this, a rather stark way, is to look at OECD data on the average effective age of retirement. And let me quote you the Spanish figures on this. In Spain, for example, this was 62.2 years for men in 2016 and 62.6 years for women. But in 1980, the corresponding figures were almost 65 years for men and nearly 67 years for women. So there's still a long way to go to raise average effective retirement ages and older worker employment rates in Spain to their 1980 levels, as there is in many other OECD countries. It's also important, I would argue, to understand the dynamics behind this increase in older worker employment rates. And there are really two factors behind it which are identified in the chart. One is what we call the retention rate. That is the degree to which older workers stay on working longer in the same firm. And the other is, of course, the hiring rate. That is the degree to which firms are increasing their hiring of older workers. Now, OECD data shows very clearly that the driving force behind the rising trend in older worker employment comes from the increased retention rate. That is, that older workers are staying on longer in the same firm. For example, between 2006 and 2016, this retention rate on average in the OECD increased by 10 percentage points. The disappointing news, however, is that there's been no movement in the hiring rate for older workers, even though the demographic composition of the workforce and the population is shifting towards older age cohorts. So that's a worrying trend, it seems to me, with an eye to the future. So what factors might explain it? Well, one obvious explanation is that despite the ubiquity of anti-age discrimination legislation in virtually all OECD countries nowadays, employers still have an implicit bias against hiring older workers. And there's many good supporting evidence that this is indeed part of the story. Ageism is alive and thriving in the workplace so far as hiring decisions are concerned. Another explanation would focus on the nexus between aging, skills, productivity, and wages. Now, data from the OECD survey of adult skills from 2011 and 12, covering about 20 countries or more, show that the age cognitive skills profile typically peaks around the age of 30. Those of you who are under 30 can feel really well about this, and those of us like Chris and Dora and I can feel very badly about this. It peaks at around 30 and then declines slowly among older cohorts. But the good news is that there are very large dispersions in skills within age groups, and we can all argue that we're at one end of the tail of the distribution. Now, it's tempting to make a direct leap from these age skill profiles to argue that productivity falls off as workers age. Unfortunately, it's extremely difficult to get an accurate measure of individual productivity with much accuracy. So instead, what researchers we've done is we've focused mainly on seniority pay in the hiring decision. Seniority pay measures the extent to which wages are tied to job tenure within a firm. And in all OECD countries, wages typically rise with tenure until they peak when workers are aged around 55, 56, 57, and then they decline slowly. And recent OECD evidence suggests that a large seniority wage premium is a disincentive to hiring older workers, especially in countries like Spain, where employment protection legislation is relatively strict for permanent workers and relatively lax for temporary workers. So despite the recent reforms in 2012 to employment protection legislation in Spain, it still seems plausible to me that seniority pay, combined with relatively strict employment protection for permanent workers and an unemployment insurance system which tends to subsidize temporary hires, that this partly accounts for the low hiring rate for older workers, not just in Spain, but in some other OECD countries too. So what might be done to try to increase retention and hiring of older workers? Well, one might hope, I think, that discrimination in hiring decisions against older workers might wane as employers are faced with smaller cohorts of young people in the hiring decision. But this will still require a major cultural change on the part of managers and human resource departments. So it's unlikely, I'm afraid, to come quickly. Encouraging the spread of part-time working among older workers, especially males, would also help the goal of working longer. At present, most older part-timers are females, but persuading more of their male peers to take a part-time job would be a very positive step forward in keeping them active in the labor market longer and easing their transition to retirement. But it's amazing how resistant many older males are to the idea of working part-time. So again, it requires a major cultural change that will not be easy to come. Another route would be to reduce the size of seniority pay, but this runs into big obstacles in collective bargaining systems, which are very attached to it. Yet another is to try to boost investment in skills upgrading, what people typically call lifelong learning. The problem here is that that's a nice platitude, but when you look at older workers and their employers, it's obvious that neither sees a big incentive to invest much in upgrading their skills. My view has always been on this, that it's much more important to boost investment in training for mid-career workers, those people aged between 40 and 55, in order to enable them to better face the issue of skills as they age in the workforce. Now, just to finish off, let's turn to something a little bit more speculative, i.e., can the gig economy ride to the rescue of older workers in the future? Now, some commentators, including the recent report in The Economist that Chris cited, argue that the advent of digitalization and the rise of the gig economy could provide a host of new job opportunities for many older workers who want to combine work and leisure past the normal retirement age. They point to examples such as Uber, where a quarter of all drivers in Uber are aged over 50. They also highlight the fact that older people are much more likely to start a new firm than younger workers and to be self-employed. However, they don't point out that the incidence of self-employment has always been much greater among older workers than among younger workers, so there's nothing new about that trend. As for the spread of the gig economy favoring older workers over younger workers, I think that could be true for certain occupations and tasks, but not for others. Just take one example, the case of Upwork, currently the world's largest freelancer platform. It has 12 million registered freelancers on its books and 5 million registered clients. Interestingly, 2/3 or more of the purchases of freelance services come from the OECD countries, but 2/3 of the freelancers come from Southeast Asia. And while many of the freelancers are older workers, the vast bulk of them are aged under 30. So even if the gig economy were to provide an expanding source of jobs for older workers, it would take a long time, in my view, to build up to such a scale. And it's not the only possible savior for older workers in the future. A glance at the experience of Japan over the past 2 decades is, I believe, very instructive here. The working age population in Japan has fallen sharply since the year 2000, but the labor force has been very stable over the same period. And this stability is due to a large increase in the labor force participation rate among Japanese women aged 25 to 54 and among older workers. And most of this increase in employment has gone into the healthcare sector to cater for the growing needs of an expanding elderly population in Japan. Now, Japan is aging more rapidly than any other OECD country, but we're all going to follow it. And that is an interesting example I would cite, ladies and gentlemen, that expanding healthcare and caring needs for the elderly population will provide a new source of employment to enable older workers, such as myself, to carry on working. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
So we'll take a few minutes for questions focused on John's talk, and then we'll hear from Dor, and then we'll open it up to general questions. But anyone, the equipment is failing me today. Anyone have questions or observations for John? Yeah. Right, there we go.
Thank you. Mr. Martin, I work for a company, small company, 50 Pro, which intends to help the people that gets out of any job at 50. Your figure shows how difficult it is to replace, to recolocate that people. And the intention of our company is to help them become entrepreneurs. I want your view, if you have any, why is so difficult to accept the data you have shown here? Our own statistics show that only 3% of the people aged about 50, only 3% get a job after 24 months. Despite this data, people still look for a dependent job instead of taking the alternative of trying to be by their own. Any hint that could help me get my customers?
Please.
Thank you very much. I mean, the point you're making allows me to make another point which I didn't have time to make, which is that there's a lot of evidence to show that one of the most successful active labor market measures for older workers is to encourage them to start up a new business. However, it turns out, and there's many good studies showing, for example, that for a small subsection of the older worker population, this is really a good deal. They do extremely well. But it turns out that these are not a representative sample of all of the older workers aged over 50 or 55. They tend to self-select themselves into entrepreneurship because they are more motivated, they have more experience and more skills. But I do agree with you that I think that this is a route in which public policy could strive to encourage more startups and entrepreneurship among older workers. And that, I think, it would probably be a good cost-benefit investment for society.
Other questions? Steve? Yeah.
Gracias. You say that there's a belief on the part of employers that older people are simply not going to be as productive as younger people. Is that accurate?
It's a very good question, Steve, because as I pointed out, it's extremely difficult to measure individual productivity, especially if we want to link that to people aging and controlling for all other factors. You can just find a few limited examples like sportsmen and others where it's clear that there is such a relationship. But those examples are so specific that they don't really generalize. But what I would submit, Steve, is that many employers have this image in their mind that older workers are not as productive as younger workers. And there is one area in which there is some evidence to back this up, and that is if you look at the specific category of digital skills. That is, I don't just mean narrow programming ability or whatever, I just mean the ability to extract information from many different sources and to use it to solve problems. There, the evidence from the OECD survey of adult skills is absolutely clear-cut. Older workers are much less proficient at these digital skills than the younger age cohorts. And that is a real issue looking forward. And that is one of the areas where public policy really has to step up to the mark and find ways in which one can encourage the mid-generation career workers, but also the current older workers, to improve their knowledge of digital skills.
Others? Yeah, there's one here.
Gracias. Estoy de acuerdo con muchas cosas de las que usted ha presentado, pero me gustaría añadir algunas otras sobre, al menos sobre la situación española, que es la que conozco mejor. Durante los últimos años e incluso decenios, no solamente ha habido discriminación por la edad a la hora de contratar trabajadores, sino sobre todo a la hora de los despidos masivos. En todas las grandes empresas españolas, a partir de los 52, 53 años, ha habido lo que se llama expedientes de regulación de empleo, invitando a los trabajadores de esas edades, en fin, empujando a irse de la empresa y acogerse a planes de prejubilación, esperando jubilarse, nada más. Lo mismo ha ocurrido, no solamente ha ocurrido en las empresas privadas, sino durante los años 90, las reestructuraciones de importantes sectores de la economía española, como la siderurgia, la minería, la construcción naval, se solventó, se arregló también con despidos masivos de gente de una cierta edad para arriba. Este grupo de personas, de ex trabajadores, han perdido la esperanza de encontrar trabajo. Actualmente las estadísticas del mercado de trabajo en España nos dicen que los desempleados por encima de los 40 años, más de la mitad llevan 2 años buscando y no encontrando trabajo dependiente. Es cierto que hay muchas iniciativas para ayudar a la gente a emprender, pero también es cierto que la legislación española para crear una empresa es de las peores que existen en todos los países de la OCDE. Es decir, hay muchas cosas que hacer, no solamente en las actitudes de los trabajadores mayores de una cierta edad, sino también en el conjunto de la legislación, de los planes y políticas de las grandes empresas y de los gobiernos. Gracias.
I couldn't agree more with your last point. I mean, I think, again, a point I didn't have enough time to develop, but if you look at older workers who lose their job or who are dismissed for whatever reason, then it's extremely difficult for them to get off unemployment and into a new job. Here is a case where public policy can help, but in the case of Spain, I've always argued that the role of active labor market policies is extremely underdeveloped here. The amount of resources that go into these schemes are minimal in Spain, and the organization and implementation of these schemes is really far below what I would regard as best practice among OECD countries. There has been some attempt in the last few years to improve it by seeking to develop more guidelines to regional authorities who have the responsibility for delivering these programs, but they are not well integrated in my view. They are under-resourced, and there still is a very long way to go in Spain to introduce an effective employment policy that would help many older workers renew their skills and find new jobs.
John, I'm going to ask you one last question. Yeah. Oh, there is. All right. Sorry. Please.
Don't you think that current economic situation focus on stakeholders' profitability, concentration in different sectors due to the mergers and acquisitions and so on, don't you think that this will speed up this process?
That's a difficult one. I mean, I do think that what happens in the product market in terms of mergers and concentrations and the degree of competition in different sectors is almost as important, if not as important, as many employment policy measures. But there's a strong tendency to protect insiders, both in terms of the industrial structure and in terms of workers with permanent contracts. So one really has to see how the balance of forces works out. But it should be the case that more intensive competition combined with more effective employment policies, on balance, should produce, I think, better outcomes. But it's easy to say that. It's extremely hard to get from where we now are to a different set of institutions and a different mindset in implementing those policies.
Thanks.